Hello everyone, welcome back to Debating for America's Youth. Today we have another awesome video. Today we are going to break down the Public Forum 2020 NSDA National Final Round with two of the competitors and also the national champions. Today we have Sasha, Haines, and Maggie Mills. So, hey everyone, hope you enjoy the video.
Evaluate how we view the structures of our society, and we negate. Resolved. On balance, charter schools are beneficial to the quality of education in the U.S. Observation 1. We define two factors that optimize quality education. The first is quality teachers. The ASTD reports that the most important factor in student learning is the teacher and concludes that improving teachers would improve outcomes more than any other single factor. The second is lived experiences. Run 15 reports that emotional health is the greatest predictor of life satisfaction as an adult, while academic success is the least important. Our sole contention concerns making a market out of education. Smith 19 explains that neoliberalism, not to be confused with modern-day liberals or Democrats, is an ideology that affirms the value of free market competition. Metcalf 17 furthers that neoliberalism views the free market economy as the model for all human activity. In terms of education, Morale 11 explains that charter schools are a function of neoliberalism insofar as they compete with traditional schools for both students and tax funding. Subpoint A is the marketization of education space. Blakely 17 writes that in the private sector, competition creates winners and losers, but in the public sphere, the effects of a school losing are catastrophic. Berkeley 19 writes that neoliberals have spent millions of dollars per year funding think tanks that have exercised control over legislation to prioritize charter over public schools. This includes tax credits for funding charter schools and distributing immigration visas in exchange for foreign investment into charters. They conclude that the federal government is deliberately undermining the public school system by using private money and public funds to build charter schools instead of investing in a more robust public school system. There are two impacts. The first is teachers. The EPI 19 finds that the current funding crisis has led to schools not having the funds to staff vacancies, leading to a massive teacher shortage crisis in public schools. Wheel 20 finds that losing 10% of school budgets would cause 173,000 teaching jobs to be lost. The second impact is education deserts. Barnum 19 finds that the effects of siphoning away funding from public schools can be irreversible, as districts often recoup less than 20% of lost funding each year. As a result, Blakely 17 writes that in places like Detroit, due to the widespread defunding and closing of schools, there are now educational deserts where students have to travel for hours just to attend school. Additionally, Larson 14 finds that students experiencing school closure are 10% more likely to drop out. This issue disproportionately impacts low-income students, as Blakely 17 reports that the wealthy can simply move their children to other schools. Neoliberal market competition in education creates a vicious cycle in which low-income communities are further punished for their poverty. Subpoint B is the commodification of outcomes. Sunbaum 18 reports that charter schools must achieve strict academic outcomes in order to stay open and attract students. This is because, as Real 16 explains, neoliberal reformists increase the emphasis on standardized testing as a metric to evaluate the quality of charter schools as compared to public schools. As a result, Simon 13 writes that charter and public schools are locked in a market competition with outcomes hinging on test results, in other words, proliferating the system's emphasis on them. There are two impacts. The first is teachers. Ollie 19 reports that because of the neoliberal model's reliance on testing, a teacher's effectiveness and often pay is measured by test results. This pressures teachers to use highly scripted curriculums, leading to an exodus from the profession. The second impact is degraded critical thinking. Saltman 10 reports that value is now defined by test scores. Because there is finite study time, there is no place for learning that doesn't raise scores, and he concludes that the ethical, social, historical, and political aspects of our lives are no longer relevant to education. As a result, Watkins 12 explains that the education system ignores the social context in which students learn, in effect erasing their identities. Crucially, Saltman 09 explains that such critical knowledge is necessary if students are to engage as public citizens in the forming and sustaining of communities. Mulder 18 concludes that existing inequalities are thus reinforced within the system. It fosters an acceptance of the capitalist status quo and the hierarchical structures within it, reinforcing the structural inequality it was designed to combat. Giroux 11 writes that no democratic society can survive without educational practices which produce citizens who are critical, self-reflective, willing to make moral judgments, and act in a socially responsible fashion, for which reason we are proud to negate.
Okay, so obviously, since it's their case, we don't really have a lot to say about it. It was a really good case. I thought it was probably one of the best that we had heard at this tournament, especially because it was more of a nuanced argument that, again, wasn't popular on the topic. And I thought it was really well thought out. And I appreciated how it was different from different debate cases in the sense that it used a lot of logic and just what's happened in the past in order to formulate the argument, instead of just name dropping a bunch of different cards and trying to make a link chain out of it. Like they really thought about history and the purpose of charter schools and crafted a case around it, which is why I think it was so successful for them.
Yeah, I also really, really loved that. I don't know, I feel like, as Sasha said, there's this emphasis now on having cases with, super long link chains and really quantified impacts. And in our case, a little bit as well, but I think in their case, they didn't really have necessarily quantified impacts in the sense that there's like a terminalized number, but I thought that it was so great in that it really did tie into the idea of quality of education in the United States, because I think that what most people had a problem with on this topic was quantifying something as nebulous as quality of education, because that's something that's different for everyone, right? But ultimately, when they impact to something as important as, critical thinking, I think that that's really powerful when it comes to higher level cases that don't rely just on numbers.
And this is something we'll probably talk more about when we get to our case, because it's a strategy that we follow pretty closely, but we appreciate cases that have really strong narratives, and that's the way in which we've debated throughout high school, and whether or not that works at every single tournament is up to the debaters and the judges to decide. But especially at this tournament, if you look at a lot of the cases that got far, they were narrative heavy, and they started out right at the gate pushing this story that they carry through the round. And the other team did a really, really good job at this, in the sense that they start off almost with a weighing mechanism, which isn't really used as much anymore, but was quite persuasive, especially considering it was in all of their other speeches.
Sole contention is reforming the education system. In the early 1990s, America's public education system was failing. To combat this, President Clinton, Bush, and Obama championed the school reform movement, which saw charter schools as an important tool. Future Ed 18 quantifies that since then, the number of charter students has increased by 2.4 million, and the movement has succeeded. According to Lee of Boston College 18, public high school graduation rates in the United States have increased over the past 15 years and now stand at an all-time high of 83%. Charter schools have been responsible for this movement and the overall quality of education for two reasons. The first one is for allowing by specialization. Charter schools foster a more innovative approach to teaching. Butcher of Real Clear Policy 13 reports that instead of having to abide lockstep with standardized curricula, charter schools choose their own curriculum to meet the individual needs of their students, allowing for more specialization and innovation within the classroom. This helps at-risk populations in particular. Swabach of the Heritage Foundation 19 finds that innovative curricula give public charter schools the opportunity to impact specific communities and tailor their programs to them, for example, low-income communities. In a 2015 study that examined over 1 million charter school records, the Center for Research on Education Outcomes 15 compared charters to similarly situated district schools and established that charters create substantial gains for students in poverty. In low-income areas, students at charters saw gains equivalent to 43 additional days of learning per year. Across the board, a more personalized approach to learning benefits educational quality. Booker of Mathematica 14 found that high school graduation rates are up 11% higher at charter schools than at similar district schools. But the second way is by reforming district schools. Unlike regular district schools, charters are founded on the belief that all students, not just affluent ones who can afford private schools, should be able to choose where they receive an education. In districts without charters, Forster of the Friedman Foundation 18 concludes that the monopoly system of public education ensures that no meaningful accountability for performance can occur. Providing school choice holds school administrators accountable, especially since public schools receive funding on a per-student basis, incentivizing them to retain as many students as possible. To remain viable, district schools invest the same focused, innovative teaching as charters. Holly of Education Next 13 explains this phenomenon, stating that district schools implement reforms that use resources more effectively, improve the overall quality of education within the traditional public school, and increase responsiveness to student needs. This is relatively easy to do, as Giangelis of the Cato Institute 20 writes that monopoly power in the traditional public school system leads to bloat in administration and a wasteful use of funds. He concludes, however, that competitive pressures create strong incentives to spend money on direct classroom expenditures. The numbers check out. In a 14-year analysis of nearly 600 charter schools, Cords of Temple University 17 finds that charter schools triggered an average increase in instructional spending by 7%, with Jackson of UC Berkeley 16 finding could lead to an additional 0.46 years of completed education. In addition to spending more on student instruction, district schools often begin to collaborate with nearby charters. Holly explains that in a study of 12 districts, 8 out of the 12 locations, cooperations led to the replication of successful charter school practices within district schools. It is for these reasons that Cordes explains the introduction of a charter school within 1 mile of a district school decreases the rate at which students are held back a grade by 40%. This is one of the best indicators of educational quality, since it means that struggling students begin to receive better instruction, which gave them a chance at successful educations in life. Indeed, Hughes of Texas A&M University 17 found that being held back increases the likelihood of a student dropping out of high school by 3 times. Overall, because charters fill in the cracks of the failing public education system, Maggie and I are proud to affirm.
Okay. Maggie, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So Sasha already mentioned when talking about their case that we really like to run cases that had a strong narrative. And I think that as our case writing became better, we started to think about 2 things when we were writing these cases. So the first would be our own arguments. So that would be, is it a truthful argument? We always like to run one contention cases because we thought it was really easy to tell a story with those cases and to link arguments together in a way that made a lot of sense. We also had to make sure, we had good evidence and that our cases were able to be collapsed later in the round. So we had things that we could then condense when it came time for summary and final focus. But then the second thing I think we thought about a lot when we were writing the cases for the charter school topic was how we were going to preempt other cases and other teams' arguments. So one thing that really helped us during our senior year is that before we wrote cases on either side, we would try to think about what the other team will be collapsing to, what impacts, what key arguments. And on the charter school topic, most of the arguments on the con side have to do with degrading the district education system. And it wasn't as clear in this round because their framework was neoliberalism, which was more broad and extended to the entire education system. But most of the rounds on the con side would collapse down to you're hurting the students who are in district schools because you're taking away funding and that sort of thing. So in our pro case, we wanted to include arguments regarding both charter schools improving education singularly, but then also that district schools get better when charter schools are nearby, because that way we access the 2 main facets of the debate, and then it's much harder for an opposing team to outweigh either argument.
Right. And just Maggie covered most of it, but just something brief is we run cases that usually are one contention with multiple different links into it because we find that it's the most strategic way to push the same argument the entire round without having to win every single facet of it. So in this case, we could collapse to subpoint A and still be able to win our argument, or subpoint B and still be able to win our argument. And we found that to be a lot easier and more successful as opposed to running 2 contentions or 3 contentions that have nothing to do with each other. But also, if you've worked with either of us before or talked to us about case strategies, you'll know that we're huge advocates of running stock arguments. And that doesn't mean run what seems easiest. That means run what seems the most true. And that's usually why we choose those arguments, is because they inherently are the most true. And you don't need some long, elaborate link chain in order to get to your argument. Both you and the judge and your opponents usually know that what you're arguing is what actually is happening or what would actually happen in the real world. And for those reasons, that's why a lot of the nuanced arguments stem from stock arguments or have links that are very stereotypical on a topic. And why we always would stick to them or find arguments similar to them is because they're usually the easiest to win. And at the end of the day, you want to get to the ballot in the quickest and easiest path possible. And running arguments that are just correct is, in our opinion, the best way to do that.
Yeah, and I was really happy. I was so happy that in the final round, whether we won or lost, it was going to be our last debate round ever. So I was so happy, and I think Sasha was too, that we got to debate a case that was really well thought out and intelligent and wasn't squirrely with a lot of different contentions, because we never liked running cases with a lot of different subpoints that didn't really make a lot of sense. It's been a trend in PF to just read a ton of evidence and read tricky arguments, but I think that when it comes to gaining intellect and gaining real world skills and the ability to think and that sort of thing, it's always a really good exercise to see if you can take something that seems obvious and then, turn it to the other side, like we tried to do with the district schools argument, or as Sasha said, take a stock argument and think about it and do a lot of research, do the research on the history of it, and then come up with a really nuanced way to win that argument.
Yep, I'm all good. You can start with first question whenever you're ready.
Sounds good. Thank you. Let's say I were to be charitable and grant you a lot of the advantages of charter schools. What happens to the 50 million students in the public school system whose schools don't have the market ability to compete with charter schools?
Sure. So here's what Maggie and I tell you from our case. We tell you that even though you say competition is good, in this round, we're going to argue that the competition that district schools provides public schools is actually a good thing. And that's really important, because before the introduction of charter schools into the market, as you would claim, we didn't really see public schools reforming themselves or cutting back their waste or doing everything that we tell you in the case. That's where uniquely we benefit those students, those 51 million students that you talk about, because for the first time we're offering a chance of change. But I'm going to ask you a question on your case, if that's okay.
Can I clarify something first?
Of course, go ahead.
Which is that in your case, you basically say competition is the incentive for reform. And then at the bottom of the case, you say it's great innovation because they're collaborating. So are they collaborating or are they competitive entities?
So there's a difference here, right? Charter schools and public schools or district schools, we would say, have the vested interest of making themselves better. When one improves, they're improving quality of education. The other sees that and wants to improve the quality of education for the other students in the other given school, vice versa. I'm going to ask you a question. No, we would say you can collaborate and still compete. You can still share ideas. And I'm just going to ask you a question on your case. We've spent a lot of time on this. So,
okay. So Leanna asked a really good question here that's strategic and that I think a lot of first speakers should aim to do in a round, and that is asking questions that are super explicit, that what you predict is going to be the main clash of the round. And in this case, the main clash of the round was who's impacting the most people. Is it public schools that are like public school kids going to be helped, or are they going to be hurt? And my biggest tip, I guess, when you're asked a really, really explicit question like this that usually has a very obvious answer, is just try to insert your narrative and push it the best you can. And that's what I attempted to do here, is go back, like look back to our case where we tell you like helping district schools happens when you have more charter schools, or like you see the educational outcome of district schools increase when there's a charter school in the area. And a lot of the times, like the reason as to why they're asking that question is not for you to concede your case, but rather for them to get ahead in the narrative argument or look more correct than the other team.
Yeah, I also think this was the point in the round at which it became clear that a lot of the clash was going to happen on this idea of competition, and both teams started to sort of focus in on that idea because their entire case was based on this premise of neoliberalism that was basically that the marketization and the heavily competitive approach that was placed on charter schools was a bad thing and led to things like standardization, which is bad. And then our entire case was based on the idea that competition is actually really good and it helps district schools. So ultimately, right from that first crossfire, we knew that it was going to come down to who was going to win the idea of competition.
The thesis of your case towards the bottom is that we're implementing measures like standardized testing that inhibit students from learning creatively, right?
Well, let me clarify. You tell us that in the 1990s, education was failing. We contend that before the 1990s and the introduction of charter schools, schools were more focused on critical thinking skills, but whenever there were competitive entities in the market, neoliberals knew there needed to be an objective metric of evaluation to compare the value of the goods.
Really quickly, I'm going to ask my question now. So if that's the case, and if standardized testing is what is inhibiting critical thinking from happening, what has been the general trend of standardized testing since 2015?
Schools focused almost exclusively on it to the exclusion of more important skills.
So according to the Washington Post, the amount of standardized tests that have been given both through charters and district schools has been cut in half since 2015. So if market structures are the reason as to why standardized testing is happening, then why are we seeing standardized testing decrease?
I mean, we're going to contest that that is in fact the trend. But if you think about it on a logical basis, because we're going to have competing evidence, it makes sense, right? Because if the outcome is always evaluated by the effects of standardized tests, why wouldn't teachers teach to the test? Why wouldn't students be learning that? Because it's the only way they've been taught to be successful in the new.
But on the flip side of that, if the competition is good, like I say it is. And we're seeing schools try to improve themselves. And charter schools, for example, acknowledge that standardized testing really isn't that great. And we're seeing the trend of standardized testing, which is the link into your case, go away. Then obviously the competition isn't really that bad.
Well, we're going to contest that standardized testing trends are going down, but the more important thing is that competition on your side of the debate is what leads to the closure of 234 public schools in Detroit because they simply didn't have the funds to compete. But I believe that's the end of competition.
Okay, so we're going to get into this more after or during Maggie's rebuttal, but the way in which you break down or try to understand a case or an argument when you've never heard it before can be a little bit scary, but it's actually it's a little bit easier than a lot of the times teams will think it is, and there's a few things that you need to do in order to start understanding what's going on and then figure out how to respond to it. And what we would recommend the most is break down the link chain, break down their impacts, and look at it and ask yourself, why did this happen? How does this happen? What needs to happen in order for their impacts to happen? And that's what Maggie and I had done upon hearing this case. And I guess like the biggest question we had asked ourselves was, okay, what is their reason or what is the indication that they use to show that this trend is happening or charter schools are making the educational system worse? And in that case, it was the standardized test, right? Their reason or their proof that education was getting worse was the standardization of our educational system. So that's where we started to attack. But a lot of the times, if you spread out the link chain and look at all the pieces that they have to the story, there'll be a few holes or there'll be a place in which you can try to monopolize and turn the argument back to their side. And that's what I had tried to do through this question, right? She responded pretty well in the sense that she just pigeonholed it into being an argument about evidence, but at the end of the day, like what I would recommend doing is when you don't know what's going on, look for the small things. Don't try to tackle the argument all at once. In this case, the small thing was whether or not standardized testing is increasing or decreasing.
Yeah, and I think Liana and Sasha both did a really good job of setting up their partners for rebuttal, because Liana started to talk about this idea that competition is a bad thing and did a really good job of linking our argument back into her case. And then Sasha did a really good idea of, again, extending our narrative and breaking down the smaller points of their case about things like standardized testing going down.
Off with two observations that you can flow either at the top of their case or the bottom, wherever you have room. If you don't have room anywhere, then maybe use a separate sheet of paper, but it shouldn't be too long. And then it will just be going down their case. Is everybody ready? Okay. Let's start the time now. Start off with an observation. All of their evidence must be discredited. Don't be fooled by the official sounding names of the statistics they read, because one, they stem from charter lobbying groups. Lecker 19 reports that the effort to push charter schools is by wealthy, out-of-state individuals with no connection to the education system. Mulder 18 reports that this lobbying was done in opposition to actual educators and students. And indeed, Roy 15 writes that charter schools were the biggest special interest group in state politics, outspending teacher unions 2-1. But secondly is that Rizka 16 writes that charter schools use selection bias. Because they're less regulated, they can require students who apply for lotteries to fill out immense applications, attracting engaged parents and already high-achieving students. They conclude that students who enter charter schools were already higher achieving than their peers. That means obviously some studies will be skewed towards charter schools, but that does not mean that they're better educators. Thirdly is because Rizka 16 reports that charter schools disproportionately suspend Black students and students with special needs, ranging from those with disabilities to English language learners, as a way to disincentivize students who are underperforming to continue attending, artificially raising their test scores. For that reason, the Institute of Education Sciences writes in their meta-analysis of analyzing numerous studies with only strong methodological designs that charter schools do not have a significant impact on students' achievement. At that point, the only thing they do is siphon away funds and orient thinking into a mode of exclusively standardized testing. But then the second observation is that charter schools reify structures of oppression by simply making students cogs in the machine for neoliberals, which is why Connor 16 writes that the neoliberalization of public education has resulted in resources being distributed upwards to the elites who don't need them. This turns their contentions about innovation in district schools, because all of these innovations and competitions are necessarily geared towards increasing test scores to maximize like these market value rather than critiquing structural inequalities. That's why all of their impact cards are talking about extra days of learning, which are evaluated through tests. This is why it's going to be actively harmful, as the JR CIRF writes that because there are so many variables that affect educational outcomes, like parental relations or access to resources, the actual quality of the school is only 14% in determining outcomes. At that point, we would say the only risk that you actually solve these education gaps is if you produce students who can actually solve back for all of the other things that decrease education gaps. But let's go on to their first contention about specialization and innovation. One, the NPE explains that charter school administrators work to just replicate other charters' education models to increase their chance of success, and that in the status quo, 87% of charter schools are no longer doing these specialization tactics. But secondly, you can turn it against them, as Mulder 18 reports that when charters and public education systems compete for tax dollars and students, it actually disincentivizes innovation, because if you were to share those positive changes, that would mean that you lose prospective students. And at that point, he concludes that overall innovation in the specialization is slowing down. But thirdly, Perspective 15 finds that when you isolate specifically for these different curriculum approaches that charter schools do, rather than just reading these broad statistics as they do, you see that the specific innovations have actually decreased educational outcomes. Our evidence is a lot more specific, so you have to prefer it. Go on to their second warrant about district schools. One, they say that monopolies means that there's no innovation, but they never read evidence that public schools had bad educational outcomes prior to this, only that they were bloated. But we would say the Saltman evidence we read you tells you that because of the standardized testing, there's been a trade-off from the social, political, and ethical aspects of our lives. It doesn't matter if public schools are bloated if they were in the past producing citizens that could critique the status quo, which is needed to actually solve back for the vast majority of the education crisis. But secondly, their evidence doesn't take into account things like the coronavirus and the resulting recession. As Baruch 20 explains that because state revenue has decreased, like public schools have already had to make tons of budget cuts, which is why our first contention about closures is always going to be the more likely argument, because in the status quo, they can't afford to just make these innovations. But thirdly, while it may be true that some public schools can afford to compete with charters, specifically ones in high income areas that have lots of funding to begin with, our Blakely evidence finds that in poor areas, public schools don't have the funds and resources to compete with charters, which is why they shut down. But lastly, they say that they take away from like these bloated administrations to increase educational days and whatnot, but the places that they're usually cutting from to decrease their bloated administration is things like janitorial services and guidance counselors, and that's really detrimental, because the run evidence we read you on PACE tells you that emotional health by creating motivation is the biggest predictor in both academic achievement and lifetime outcomes, which means that if they cut away from like janitorial services, guidance counselors, etc., they have an on-net decrease in like the academic achievements of students. Because we believe students are more than a cog in the machine, we are very happy to negate. Thank you.
So I thought David's rebuttal was really, really great. I think in particular, he did a really good job of tying his responses back to his narrative. And that's something I also really try to do in rebuttal, and something I know Sasha tries to do in summary, is that the purpose of a narrative isn't just to have a good case, but it's to be able to trump all other arguments in a round by pulling their arguments into the bigger picture that you are painting. And I think that David did a really good job of, using his case to preempt our arguments, or, even when he read a separate turn, somehow tying it back to the idea of neoliberalism. And when you approach a rebuttal in that way, it makes it much easier to not only prove your arguments, but also to impact them and weigh them than it is if you're reading 15 different very blippy turns that don't really add much.
Yeah, and I think he was pretty strategic with the observations that he read, because it almost was like an extension of his case, but not explicitly an extension of it, right? And it like helped to continue to drive his narrative, even though he wasn't really talking about it. And it made it arguably more difficult for us, because now we have more of this narrative that we have to try to cover, and it's his case is still very much present, as Maggie said, in this first rebuttal, whereas usually teams just drop their case and go for the other team's case.
They start with a couple of observations. The first thing is that they try to indict every single study they read without calling for any of our evidence. We cite like Mathematica and Princeton. We know which pro-charter school organizations look like. We're not citing them either. They have to actually call for cards in order to prove any of that's true. But then on the skimming argument, according to the RAND Corporation, in a nationwide study, charter school students are already lower achieving than district school counterparts. You can't look at national averages on this. You have to do the comparative between charter schools and district schools close by. And when you do that comparative, charter school students are actually lower performing initially. But then on zero tolerance policies, we would say this is a non-issue. They're going down in the status quo according to the council, or according to the Christian Science Monitor. Most schools that were using zero tolerance policies recognize that they're not a good thing, and their use is no longer widespread. Their second observation is just a cross application of their case. I'll talk about that later. But then he says that the quality of the school system is primarily about emotions and that only 14% actually comes from the classroom. Sasha and I contend the emotional development of students occurs in the classroom. So if we can prove to you that students have a better classroom environment, we're impacting that other 86% as well. But on innovation, you can group all of their responses. They're all about the fact that innovation doesn't happen. But we call for their card. And it looks at testing data, which first of all goes against their case in the first place, from 2005 to 2006. Not only does all of our evidence post-date that, but we would say that the charter boom happened after 2015 significantly in the last couple of years, according to the Wall Street Journal, which means that the innovation that we are talking about is still happening. But then on outcomes, they basically cross-apply their case. But one really important thing they talk about is how Corona and the recession, and you're going to see more school cuts. We would say that the innovation that we're talking about doesn't actually cost money, it costs reallocations. According to the Washington Post, district schools have wasted $800 billion in the last 20 years. There is enough administrative waste to go around. But then they also give you the response that the waste that is cut is not things like bloat that we talk about, but of course is an analytic because the card doesn't exist. They never respond to CORDS, who tells you that empirically when a charter school moves in near a district, you see 7% increases in student expenditures, which can decrease dropouts by as much as 3 clowns. That was clean dropped. But let's look at their case. On face, it's predicated on the assumption that it is charter schools that created the neoliberalist environment of our public school system. We would say that that's not true, that as long as there have been things like private schools that create competition. The issue is that now we have a competition that is available for low-income public school students, and that is a good thing. But now let's go down their specific contentions. First, a marketization. Couple of responses. First, DeAngelis tells you that, again, you're just reallocating spending. This is our entire case. But if you don't believe that, we would just say that throwing money at the problem isn't going to make it better. Before charter schools, education in the United States was failing. But since we saw a boom in charter schools, we saw graduation rates increase to an all-time high of 83%. They have a couple of impacts. The first is teachers. We would say that, first of all, teachers' unions really make it hard for widespread teacher cuts across the board. But I'm going to talk more about teachers a little bit later. But then they talk about educational deserts. We would say that education deserts are only bad if there's no schools for these students to move to. According to Kemp of NYU, in highly concentrated urban areas where charter schools are usually located, students are able to move to charter schools, which is why he concludes that actually graduation rates are increased when school closures happen. But now let's look to commodification. Their timeline on this is all wrong. They say that bad education happened.
So really quickly on this idea, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for rebuttal, I knew that this late in the tournament, they were going to be prepped for, turns and delinks about standardization not being bad or standardized testing being good. So I think that when you're debating a case that's really, really well written and is heavily narrative driven like theirs is, I think the best way to take that case down is to focus on cutting it off at the top. And what I mean by that is figuring out what the crux of that argument is and then destroying the argument there rather than trying to focus on the links that happen later down in the case or the minutia that then come up later. So I knew going into rebuttal that the main point of their case was the idea that charter schools caused standardization and neoliberalization. So immediately I knew that if I could prove that standardization and neoliberalization either, directly weren't the cause of charter schools, but more importantly were happening, for example, before charter schools came onto the market, then that would sort of take out their narrative. I remember hearing in some documentary watched at school that when Sputnik happened and the space race with Russia happened, the United States was worried that it was falling behind in science and math. So they started to implement standardized curriculums. And then I knew when I thought of that could possibly work because it meant that standardization was happening before charter schools became a thing, which was in the 90s. So if standardization was happening in the 60s, then that meant that the standardization wasn't caused by the charter schools. And I think that thinking about rebuttals that way, how can I make this easy for myself and focus on, taking out one key underlying assumption, I guess, I think that ultimately can make your life a lot easier than trying to come up with a million different blocks to, different evidence and that sort of thing.
and then charter schools were the reform, and then charter schools caused standardization. But actually, according to Schrager, standardization has been around since the early 1900s when we created our public education system to turn out cogs in the machine of factories in the United States. After Sputnik in the 1960s, for example, we also saw increased standardization because we were competing with Russia. None of this happened because of charter schools, but we would say that charter schools came onto the scene to catch the students who slipped through the cracks of the public education system. Empirically, charter schools have decreased the amount of testing overall. For example, according to the Washington Post, standardized testing in the last 5 years has decreased, which directly disproves their argument. But really quickly on teachers, charter schools also break away from this system. According to Amos, they hire fewer certified teachers, which allows them to hire 50% more diverse teachers, which can increase graduation rates of Black students by as much as 13%.
So something really quickly that isn't topical, I guess, but a good strategy that took us a really long time to master is the art of grouping responses or arguments together. And I think Maggie did a really, really good job in this speech of doing that, right? Especially when she was frontlining our case. She was like, group all of his responses on innovation together and then responded to them on the whole. And I think when you have really, really content heavy rounds such as this one, being able to group the arguments together, whether on their case or your case, is a good way to save time and not get too down in the weeds. Because I know when you get down in the weeds on like the specific links of each argument, then teams start to have problems and they can't pull themselves out and get to bigger picture in time.
Yeah, and it's really easy when you have a lot of prep on a topic to do too much almost. Like in David's overview, he read two turns, or one of his points that he made was about, for example, zero tolerance policies. And that was another main argument. So Sasha and I had a lot of blocks to zero tolerance policies at that point, but I had to remind myself that it probably wasn't going to be important later in the round. So I tried to allocate as little time as possible and then focus much more on the stuff that was going to matter, which, you know, were the ideas of neoliberalism and competition and all of that.
That's all of our prep.
Great. If you're ready for cross, you can go ahead with first question.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's talk about our case where we tell you it was the introduction of standardized tests, or sorry, the introduction of charter schools that created market competition, which then was like evaluated through standardized testing. You tell me that standardization has been around since the 1900s, or that it was normalized then, but I called for your evidence and it was talking about in Prussia, not about the US.
Okay, well, we would say that regardless, the system that in the United States existed during, for example, industrialization was the same. The foundation of our public education system was to churn out workers to be, as you say, cogs in a machine.
Maybe that was...
But really quickly,
I think something really quickly that helped me, and I think Sasha too, probably as we got better with cross, is that, you know, try to take things out of the weeds. So in that situation, David said, you know, this card is from Prussia. That was my bad. It was actually a system that originated in Prussia, and it talked about the system being in the United States. I definitely should have cleared that up. But I think that what I tried to do there was take it out of the specific card and explain that, you know, regardless of the specifics of the system itself was instituted to create like cogs in a machine or something like that. And I think Crossfire is a really good time to, you know, control the room by taking things out of specific pieces of evidence or really specific links and then tying them back to your narrative in the bigger picture. Because I think a lot of the time when crossfires become unpleasant or unproductive, it's when people get too focused on one tiny detail versus using Crossfire to look at the big picture.
Even if you don't want to believe our evidence on the early 1900s, which is fine, we also give you what happened during the 60s, which when we thought we were losing the space race and losing the Cold War, the government responded by increasing standardization and starting to institute standardized testing in the United States. So can I ask you a question on your case? If that's okay?
Can we get back to this after though?
Sure. So do charter schools have to abide by
the same regulations and requirements as district schools?
Not necessarily, but if they fail to meet a very strict academic standard, then they can be closed down.
So how are those academic standards measured at charter schools?
A lot of the time it's through test scores.
But a lot of the time it's through things like graduation rates too, right?
Not really. I think it's the Sunbomb evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Sunbomb evidence tells you that they have to meet strict academic standards, and that as a result of that, it's created an over-testing.
So in the United States, holistically speaking, what is the trend to how we evaluate schools? Where is that trend headed?
We would say even in the past 5 years, if we've seen a gradual decrease in standardized testing, it doesn't matter insofar as
That's not actually what I was going to say. I was going to say that according to Kandinsky, a lot of states, for example, our home state of Ohio, are reevaluating the way by which they evaluate how schools are performing. And instead of focusing on teacher performance, things like test scores.
Really quickly, something that I think a lot of debaters stray away from, which I think can be really strategic when you use it the right way, is talking about the arguments in the context of what's happening actually in the world. So in this example, Maggie and her crossfire had said, we have seen a decrease in standardized testing in the state of Ohio. And I mean, obviously we don't have a source off the top of, or on hand that says this. And obviously since you have Wi-Fi now, it's easier to find something like that. But by making the argument seem real and putting it in the context of what's actually happening relative to everyday life, we find that can really help to drive narratives more and make your argument more believable, right? This, for example, this panel here is predominantly teachers. And when we talk about standardized testing rates and we say, look at what's happening in the states right now, look at what happens, most teachers don't teach to a test as much as they had before. That's one way to make your argument really believable without dropping just statistics 10% decrease in tests that don't really make that much sense without contextualization.
I also think that's a really helpful tip. Oh, sorry, Nathan, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to add one other thing. David actually mentioned this during our look at this round, but I don't know if, I think it might have got cut. If you look at how Maggie is standing and projecting versus how David is kind of sitting, he's kind of hunched over and he keeps looking at his away from the screen. And even though it's online, it's very important to stand there and look at the people you're presenting to the camera and to project and to kind of roll your shoulders back. It's just the way that Maggie, you're standing versus David. He this is what he was saying about it's definitely a thing of strength between the two of you.
Well, that's yeah. I think with online, it actually becomes even more important when it comes to being perceptually dominant. I think Sasha and I had a lot of trouble with that originally because, if we were debating male debaters or, people who were really loud or people who were way taller than we were, we had issues sometimes appearing we knew what we were talking about and appearing we were in charge. And especially with things being online, I think it's even more important to, and it's so much harder, instead of talking over here, making eye contact with your webcam, which feels awkward, but I feel it makes a really big difference. And, standing to replicate what it's like to be in an actual round and adding a little bit of pressure to the situation, that sort of thing. I think it just improves performance, but then also it keeps the judges a little more engaged because it makes it seem more personal.
Yeah, so I know we were going to talk about this a little later probably, but we can do it now since we're on the topic. But there's many little ways that you can make online debate seem more in person, even if you don't have a nice camera or really nice lights or a tabletop like we had in this instance. So for example, you can try to do things have little lights. So for example, I'm sitting at a desk right now in college. Obviously I don't have studio lights here, but I do have this little tiny table side lamp that's right next to my face. So it makes me look like I'm on camera and you can see me and it's not super muffled, I think. I mean, obviously I just see what's coming out of my camera, so I don't know, but I would hope it does that. Thank you, Maggie. Or for example, you can turn up your microphone volume so that way you can dominate more in crossfire, which is something a lot of people don't know. But that way, the judge hears you over your opponents. Obviously, don't monopolize on that, but that's something you can do. Or stand up, as Maggie said. For TOC, it didn't go very well for us, and we think it's mainly because we didn't treat it like a real tournament, right? I wore sweatpants underneath my dress. That didn't make me feel like I was debating. It made me feel like I was just hanging out at debate practice. And so forcing yourself to mimic the environment of a real tournament is one of the best ways we think you can succeed in online debate, because ultimately, like, when your brain knows what's happening when you're in a debate round, there's like a certain feeling, and emulating that makes it easier to debate, and we think you debate more successfully.
On things like graduation rates, and as you say in your case, student satisfaction.
Okay, that's fine. Even if those schools are doing it though, the Simon evidence explains that like prospective parents evaluate market competition based on test scores, which then creates the NSDA.
Okay, so if you were a parent, really quickly, if you were a parent,
we only have 40 seconds left.
Yeah,
now,
go
can
ahead.
we get back to my critical thinking thing?
Yeah.
So you tell me that like in times of war or like mass innovation or arms races, we've seen these like standardized testing within classrooms, right? But insofar as the...
Not necessarily. I don't think you can necessarily interpret that to be times of war. That was a very specific situation when the space race explicitly focused
Yeah,
us
exactly.
on
So
STEM.
when we... So
you
when
can't
we
extrapolate that to all times of
right.
war.
So like, sure. So like when we need mass innovation, but in times when we don't need these mass innovations, like, is there still this over testing?
Yeah, probably. I would say that we're at a time right now when there's no huge like war necessarily looming. I mean, there are obviously conflicts happening, but we still see a decrease in like we would say that testing.
Yeah, but that's like after.
Yeah, the point that Sasha and I are trying to make, let's not get too down in the weeds, is that testing has been around for 60 years, a long time before charter.
Well, only during the times of like mass innovation, but yeah, that's the end across.
Do you guys have a piece of that?
Maggie, is there anything you want to add?
I don't have anything.
Okay, let's keep going.
Re-engineered this
No.
a weighing overview, and then it's going to be dealing with our case, extending the observations on their case, and then dealing with their case. Is everyone ready? Okay, sounds good. Start off with a weighing overview. We always outweigh on scope because they impact students who are only in charter schools, which is only 2 million kids in the population. Our impacts say that charter schools have fundamentally re-engineered the schooling terrain, permanently affecting the pedagogies of all 50 million kids across the United States. Then, though, we're also the prerequisite because of the JRF evidence that David raised that shows clean conceded, which says that the quality of the school you go to as a function of choice only accounts for 14% of your educational outcomes. At that point, you functionally can't solve the root cause of educational barriers without fostering citizens that can critique the status quo and not reinforce structural inequality. This is always going to outweigh because on their side, they make it impossible to dismantle neoliberal structures in the future as students are trained from right when they enter school to not think critically, but rather to maximize their market value through test scores. On the top of our case on private schools, they basically say, well, first of all, this means that their second warrant doesn't matter because in that case, charters would already be incentivized to innovate. It's not a specific function of charter schools, but secondly, or public schools. But the second thing is that we're not talking about the same market. It's lower income students who can't go to private schools, so the specific competition was to cater to the vast majority of the population, which would either go to a public school or a charter school. On funding, though, first, I'd like to note she says she's going to respond to teachers, but she doesn't, so that office is pretty cleanly extended, and 173,000 person funding shortage because of the reallocation of funds, which goes away. That Berkeley evidence was not responded to about how now, like, priorities of school governments or of district governments are in a different direction, meaning that you're not getting funding for teachers. But more importantly, on deserts, all they say is that deserts aren't bad if students can go to other regions. That means that they cleanly concede Blakely about low-income areas where there aren't other schools. That's Detroit, that's Philadelphia. They clean conceded 234 schools in Detroit closing down because students didn't have another option, leaving hundreds of thousands out of school. The weighing is really simple because 50 million kids are in public schools, only 2 million are in private school, are in charter schools, and it's disproportionately affecting low-income students. On standardized testing, the Schrager card that they read about how this is non-unique is about Prussia, and all it says is that education was standardized. It says nothing about testing itself. Compare this to the nuance of our evidence, which comes from Saltman, which says that schools used to do political skills, but because of the introduction of market competition, now they're not. Their Washington Post evidence just talked about the ACT and the SAT. To be very clear, that's not our impact. Our impact is about the focus of people in schools. They're only teaching to the test because the Simon evidence tells you that how successful charter schools and public schools are is hinged on their standardized test results, so it makes a lot of sense they would only be focusing on that. Then they say that they're hiring more diverse teachers. This is fundamentally unresponsive because we are talking about teachers' incentives once they're in schools, not the people who are teaching in the first place. You know, they're just, if anything, reinforcing what Mulder says is the status quo of structural inequality because people aren't critiquing it. On their case, they basically drop on competition the turn about how competition decreases because whenever they're competitive market entities, they're not sharing any innovation and it's duplicative at the very best. But on district schools, they give you no evidence that that public schools are currently doing bad, just that they're extremely bloated. We would say the trade-off is away from good curriculum. If anything, you're just seeing more emphasis on standardized tests in district schools. They also misunderstand the point about COVID, which is that money has already been cut, meaning that administrative budgets would have already been cut, meaning that in public schools, you're going to see literal closures because they can't take away from administration. They're going to take away from the existence of the school itself, for which reason we're very proud to negate.
Okay, so she covered so much in the summary. Like, I listened to the summary over and over again. I'm like, how did she do that all so time efficiently? And it's quite impressive. But so something that she had done that we kind of hinted at the beginning when we were talking about case structures and having a bunch of different arguments that feed into one impact or overarching argument is the ability to collapse and choose what you want to go for while not having to completely re-extend big ideas. And she did this in the sense that she pulled through arguments like deserts or teachers, which arguably had less ink on it than some of the other like market structure arguments that they were running. And the way that they did that is quite strategic in my opinion, because they're still winning this neoliberalism argument overarchingly with different ways to get to it. And that's also what she did when she was responding to our case again, is she went for the big turns, not the specific links that Maggie responded to. And that can be very, very strategic in time allocation and your ability to drag through what's important and what's not.
I'm going to start on our case, and then I'm going to go to their case. Is anyone not ready? The argument that is winning this round today is the idea that we're improving district schools, which on the whole helps to break the systematic oppression that they talk about in their case. They have three ways in which you can weigh this round. All of them don't make a lot of sense. The first is on scope. They say we're only impacting up to charter schools. That's not true. When you have a charter school in the area, empirically, it improves not only the graduation rates, but the outcome later in life of those students located in district schools near it. That's really good. But they also say they prerequisite our case because quality schools only offer 14% of emotional development. We would say, first off, considering that students spend the majority of their day within school, we would say, yes, schools play a large part in the emotional development. We would also say having a good school means you're probably going to be better off emotionally. On net, we are winning this round. But let's talk about our arguments. They try to read one turn by saying innovation decrease. First of all, our argument is not innovation, it's specialization. But also, they don't quantify how much this happens. Cords tells you that even if you want to believe their evidence, on net spending on district schools increases by 7% when you have competition existing. That's really good because remember, the competition we're talking about is not bad competition. It's good competition that incentivizes the quality of education across the board to get better. But then they also say, because of coronavirus, we're seeing budgets being cut. First off, they don't quantify how much budgets are being cut, but we would also say, considering the public education system has wasted $800 billion, and according to Forrester, they tell you when you cut money from the system, they're not cutting bad things like programs, they're cutting administrative bloat that helps them become more effective and educate more students in the long run. That's really important because they don't actually respond to that argument. Remember, DeAngelis tells you we cut bloat in administration, which Cords tells you says results in a 7% increase in spending on public schools, which results in increase by 40% likelihood that students aren't held back, which means they're less likely to drop out, which means on the whole, we improve the quality of education for students in the United States, both in charter schools and out. But let's talk about their case. There's a few things that don't make sense. They first say private schools is a contradiction, that competition is happening. We're saying competition is already happening, but the difference here is charter schools is a good type of competition that we didn't have before. They have a few things they go for. The first is this argument on teachers. They say we didn't respond to it, but first off, we did. Maggie said that unions make it very hard for wages to be cut in the first place. That's why we're not seeing the mass amounts of teacher loss that they talk about. But second, you can turn it and group it with their other teacher argument where we tell you on the whole, the actual structural charter schools means that Black teachers or teachers who are minorities are 50% more likely to instruct students, which means higher graduation rates and more achievement in what they are talking about. But they collapse on this idea of testing. They have their timeline wrong. Even if you don't want to buy the evidence that we give you, remember Stuxnet, which happened way before the charter school boom, incentivizes the standardization of our education system. That's important because as a response, we implemented charter schools. They say the ACT scores doesn't matter, but it's indicative of a trend that that we're moving away from test scores. The reason as to why is because charter schools have more flexibility in their curriculum and are incentivizing district schools through competition to move away from that and look towards other methods, such as graduation rates or increased wages. Because at the end of the day, charter schools came after testing and are improving the educational system in the United States, not only for students within the schools, but also in district schools. And on net, that's better for the quality of education.
Okay, so again, I keep saying that this is a very, very content-heavy round, so the best thing you can do, especially in summary, is go only for what you have to. So in this case, on our case, I had to respond to the turn that Leanna had extended, and I had to respond to this weighing mechanism, which was very strategic on their part because it took up a decent amount of time and still helped to push the narrative of their case without it being directly related to the arguments that they were going for. So only go for what you have to, meaning like responding to turns and then the arguments that you're going to extend. And that's something that took us a long time to figure out how to do, is condense the round, but being able to find the clearest path to the ballot and just going with it is really important. And again, like, I think my biggest regret for this speech is not clarifying the Prussia thing. Maggie and I just kind of, this is like an inside joke between us now. We just let the Prussia thing go in every single speech, even though like we shouldn't have, and we had a response that it wasn't Prussia. But so making sure that like the thing that I would do in order to like prepare for a summary is I would get my highlighter out and I would highlight everything that I had to cover and I needed to make sure that I covered, so that way I could just jump from highlighted piece to highlighted piece.
Yeah, I think Sasha did a really good job of extending like one key response that we felt was most important, which is the idea that as charter school implementation increased, standardization and standardized testing specifically decreased. And then that linked into our idea about innovation going up through things like district schools, but it also sort of preempted their case almost by proving that it was the opposite, then that, you know, charter schools didn't cause standardization, but that standardization existed long before that, and then charter schools were sort of a remedy for that. And I think that there was really good clash on this round. Like, both teams, in my opinion, did a really good job of collapsing and focusing on what was important, which again led to a lot of room for like really in-depth conversation about things like competition and neoliberalism and all of that.
Speaking team, do you mind if we take the first question?
No, go right ahead.
Let's start off on this idea of standardized testing. You say that starting like with Stuxnet, with like Sputnik, sorry, we saw like an increased standardization of education. Standardizing education is different from increasing an emphasis on testing. Standardizing just means
So
we understand
what you're saying. Yeah, we would say that the standardized testing is a symptom of a standardized education, right? Because the metric by which you measure a standardized education and the quality of a standardized education is through standardized tests.
I think that's like a fairly unfounded assumption, because the evidence that we read you in case is quite specific when it says the only need to like measure between competitive entities is when there is competition between charters and publics. That's Simon, which says the outcome of the competition is one test scores. So at the very least,
if that were the case,
very much charter scores.
sure, if that were the case, then why are we seeing standardized testing decrease right now and states starting to move away from implementing standardized tests as a way of measuring success?
We gave you responses in both rebuttal and summary. I can go over some of them. The first of which is that oftentimes your evidence is referring to the SAT and the ACT. That's different. It's charter schools that have to regularly evaluate their students.
Really fast. We read two cards to you. If it's okay, if I may, I apologize. Really quickly. On the ACT, SAT card, those are two of the biggest standardized tests in the United States. If colleges, some of the most elite colleges, are now saying you don't need a standardized test to get into our school, that's moving away.
And we also give you Sure, go ahead.
Before you go to the next one.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Like, colleges' incentives are different from charter schools' incentives. The SAT and the ACT serve a different function for the charter school standardized testing.
So we would say that
relationship between abolishing the SAT and the ACT and abolishing standardized testing.
Sure. Okay. Fine. We disagree with that because we think that schools prepare students for college. But even if you don't want to buy that, we cite to you Kandinsky, who tells you that a lot of schools, like for example, our home state of Ohio, are no longer using standardized testing to evaluate the performance of their schools or their teachers.
And that's the general trend across the U.S.
This was in rebuttal, but even if it was, that's like
we talked about it in cross. Yeah.
But we have competing evidence. So again, I asked you to look at the logic, which is like, in a market, you have to be able to compare the best.
Here's where, and we would say that if we're looking at what's logically happening, we would say that everyone knows that, as you say yourself, like, students slip through the cracks when you have a standardized education system. That's why we contend that there was a boom in charter schools in 2015. We would say that there is a widespread social movement more towards what you are talking about, which is critical thinking. Like, look at us debating here right now. I think we can both say that we've learned more probably from debate than we have from school. That goes to show that, like, there is an emphasis on things like critical thinking in the United States right now.
But that's time on process is very clear.
Okay, so something that we do subconsciously without even, like, I didn't even realize I did this until I'm sitting here watching this round again, and the reason I was kind of chuckling to myself is the amount that I apologize. Both Maggie, myself, and even Leanna apologized a few times as well. And it's interesting because in debate, usually male debaters don't really apologize, don't really ask if they can have a question, they just kind of ask. But as a female, like, it's just natural intuition now for me to apologize or be like, I'm so sorry, can I have a question? Oh, or like, oh no, go ahead, I'm so sorry I interrupted you. And I think that's something that is definitely, it definitely shows that there's still strides for us to go, or us being women in debate especially, because we still have like tendencies to apologize for our actions when we don't really need to be apologizing. And it's something that both Maggie and I had to work on for a decent amount of time now, but still is very present.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things that Sasha and I tried to think about when it came to, you know, being perceptually dominant or being assertive. I think the first would be don't ask permission to do things. So instead of saying, can I have a question, or may I please have a question, which sets you up to then be refused and say, well, I'm actually going to say one more thing. Instead, just say, I'm going to take a question now, and then ask your question. And, you know, that's not rude. Do it politely. But things like that, again, paint you as the stronger presence in the room. Or as Sasha said, don't apologize for things. Like, unless you, like, there have been a couple of times where I've been like gesticulating around and I like whack Sasha in the face. Like, that deserves an apology. But most of the time when we're apologizing for things in round, it's things that don't warrant an apology. And it's things that we've been like trained to apologize for. And I think that also kind of creates a picture that you're almost submissive compared to your opponent, which again, on a lay judge or even in a very flow judge, it's just something subconscious that can hurt you when it comes to the judge making their decision. And then the last thing I think that we tried to focus on was being declarative. And Liana was also really, really good at this. And instead of, you know, saying things as a question or being unsure, like just stating things in a very declarative way, because, you know, you're sure of your argument. And if you sound uncertain about what you're saying, it casts a shade of doubt on what you're saying. It makes it seem a lot less credible. Whereas if you just stick to your guns and you say what you are saying in a way that like means a lot and makes you sound confident, I think that goes a long way.
Definitely. Other than that, content-wise, I thought was great. Okay, we can go to final now.
1 second. Okay. Time begins now. The easiest place for you to vote for us is on our subpoint B about commodification of outcomes. They functionally misunderstand our argument. We tell you it was the introduction of charter schools that made a market competition of the education system. And the Simon and Rial evidence says that as a result, neoliberal leaders passed reforms that mandated standardized testing to evaluate that market for prospective parents. Without charters, this wouldn't have happened, as there wouldn't have been any market to evaluate. As a result of this, students have lost the ability to critically think, as the ethical and political learning that has been replaced with teaching to the test, which the Mulder evidence says allows for the perpetuation of structural inequalities, as members of society can no longer actively participate in democracy. If you grant us this argument, we're winning the round. That's because of the weighing that Liana gives you, which has never adequately been responded to, which comes from JRF, which tells you that because there are so many extraneous factors in determining quality of education, like if your parents are together, access to resources, the actual school you go to only determines 14% of your educational outcomes. All they say is that schools have a major part in like emotional development. We're not talking about emotional development. It's the access to tutors, as like your parents are together, etc. And the only way that you can solve all of those structural systemic issues that cause the education gap right now and cause bad education is if you produce citizens who can think critically. At that point, in their best case scenario, they're solving 14%, we're solving 100%. So they have a few responses to this contention. Firstly, they say that private schools have the same competition, but they don't respond to Liana's frontline, that this is not competition because there are two different markets, one being for the hyper wealthy and one being for the middle class. Secondly, they talk about Stuxnet increasing standardization, but one, a lot of their evidence is literally talking talking about Prussia, not the United States. But two, this typically only happens in times when great innovation is needed. But the Saltman evidence, which is a more isolated timeline, says that it is uniquely the introduction of neoliberal policies in the 90s that made education trend away from critical thinking and like critiquing the status quo and towards standardized testing. Lastly, they talk about this ACT evidence saying that testing is going down. But one, the ACT is only one test. If you burn down a forest and then plant a few trees, you don't get credit. But secondly, our argument is not about ACT, it's about mandatory evaluatory tests. On their case, on segregation, yeah, they never respond to what we tell you, which is that there's a mass exodus of teachers because of standardized testing. It doesn't matter if there's a few more Black teachers if they all leave right after. Because we solve for the root problem and they never respond to the wane, we are very, very happy to negate. Thank you.
I thought this was a great final focus. I think that David did a really good job, in particular, of just like spending time on things that mattered and getting to everything without undercovering what was really important. I think in final focus, the main thing that I know I struggled with and what I think most debaters ultimately struggle with is allocating time between your arguments and their arguments and weighing and all of the things that you have to cover in a 2-minute long speech. And I think that David did a really good job of just like not only extending his own arguments and extending blocks and that sort of thing, but also weighing throughout. I think sometimes debaters forget that you can weigh really, really well, that in a way that isn't necessarily, I have 7 weighing mechanisms and their magnitude, scope, like whatever. I think that's sort of been the trend, but I also think that you can do like really meaningful weighing if you just focus on like who the argument is impacting, why that matters, and just think to yourself logically, like, why is what I am saying the most important thing?
Yeah, I was quite grateful that this round didn't really get that deep into the weeds like many of the past rounds had. And I think, as Maggie said, and I guess I'm just reiterating this point, but he did a really good job of making his argument at the end of the round really, really explicit. And we knew exactly what he was going for, which a lot of the times can be really difficult in a debate round.
I'm going to start on our competition argument, and then I will move to their competition argument. Okay. Everyone ready? Great. What we say in our case makes a lot of sense. DeAngelis tells you that when there's no charter school present, district schools have a monopoly, which leads to things like $800 billion worth of bloat over the course of the last 30 years. Charter schools put pressure on administrations to spend money where it counts, which is why empirically, in the most important card of the round that has gone clean dropped by them, Courts find that when a charter school moves into an area, you see an increase in instructional spending by 7%. Why is that important? It's important because it leads to a decrease in retention by 40%, which can decrease dropout rates by as much as 3 times. That's the scope right there. Not only are charter school students being better, the students in district schools are being better as well. But also we would say that when you look to the effects of charter schools holistically, you see things like better graduation rates, better income long-term, according to Baker. That means that we're not measuring by standardized test scores anymore. Across the board, you're seeing better outcomes. But let's look to their argument. They say that charter schools are bad because they created the standardization and this neoliberal fixation of our education system. We would say that that's not true. You can ignore the Prussia example if you want to. But remember, we were standardizing all the way back when Sputnik happened in order to compete with the Russians. They can say that we weren't testing, but we would say that testing is a symptom of the standardization of our education system that has been happening since the mid-60s. They called for that card and never responded to it. Even if they cite Simon that says that charter schools came around in the 90s, we're saying that doesn't matter because standardization happened before. In fact, we say that it makes a lot more sense that charter schools were a response to standardization. In Final Focus, they dropped all of their responses to specialization, where we tell you that because they don't have to abide by the same rules as district schools, charter schools can cater their programs to their specific students. That means that when they talk about that 14% number, you're helping students in the classroom to be better emotionally, but also you're solving long-term for the kind of injustices that they are talking about, because only charter schools provide an innovative approach to teaching that breaks away from the standardization of our education system. Across the board, charter schools didn't cause standardization, but they are the net that catches the students that slip through the cracks of our standardized system. Thank you.
Okay, just really quickly, I know, Maggie, you're going to have a ton of stuff to say.
So take it away.
Okay, so just a quick piece of advice is if at the end of the round you're sitting there looking your flow and you see something that does not go responded to or is very lightly covered, you need to go for it and you need to put a lot of emphasis on it. And Maggie does this in the context of the chords card, where she said, this card, the most important in the round, which goes clean dropped in every speech, insert chords. And that is one of the best ways, at least from a flow judge perspective, to win, is if there's something you know for sure has gone unresponded for, you need to hammer it in, because that just helps. Like, it is quite convincing in terms of the validity of your narrative or your argument.
And on the flip side, because this happens probably more often than that, when you get to the end of the round and you realize that they have something that you didn't respond to, that you may have dropped, and they're like, this is the most important thing in the round, and you're like, oh shoot. I think that probably happens just as often, and the best way to deal with something like that is to just focus on why your argument is fundamentally more important than theirs. So using language like, take them at their highest ground, or even if you want to grant them their entire case, that sort of thing makes it much easier for you to give up some of their evidence and some of their cards and still win. Because even if you grant them some of their arguments, if you're doing good weighing and you're doing good comparison and you're saying, even if you believe that their case is true, you're still voting for us because of this, that's something that can help avoid those problems. But just really quickly on this final focus, after David's excellent final focus, I knew that it was ultimately going to come down to this idea of neoliberalism, because the way that they wrote their case was, and continued to carry it through rebuttal and summary and that sort of thing, was that this neoliberalism is almost a prerequisite to any of the other arguments in the round. So, helping district schools doesn't matter if the only way that district schools improve is by increasing testing, which is bad, like that sort of narrative. So I knew that if we were going to win district schools and charter schools, we had to start by proving that their argument was wrong, because they did a really good job of linking their argument into all of the other arguments in the round. So I think ultimately I knew that it was coming down to the idea of whether or not charter schools caused standardization and neoliberalization. So I tried to focus on what I thought we were winning on that argument, which was that first, standardization has been around since the early 1900s and, at minimum 1960s, around the time of Sputnik, which means that standardization was already happening. And then, trying to turn that with the idea that charter school innovation was a response to standardization, and also, citing evidence about, for example, testing going down in the status quo, even as the number of charter schools is increasing. I think that, Sasha's mentioned this, I've mentioned this, but trying to stay out of the weeds in the back half of the round is really critical, because there are so many little things that are flying around by the time you get to final focus. You only have 2 minutes, you're only winning some arguments, and there are certain pieces of evidence and certain logical ideas that are just really persuasive on your side. So instead of spending a ton of time trying to hit every single little detail, focus on what's important and then blow up the stuff that you're winning and weigh it really heavily in a way that then allows you to win, even if there are little things that slip through the cracks. So I think after I talked about neoliberalism, I was able to then talk about district schools and charter schools, and then impact that way. But I think that the way that this round, boiled down, neither team necessarily was talking that much about impacts. It was much more about the logical links and the underlying assumptions of the ideas of, marketization and competition and all of that, whether or not that was good or bad. So that was a really fun final round for us to have, because it really did require a lot of thinking on the spot and critical thinking and, drawing from other areas of debate as well, and precedent and history and all of that, rather than just reading a bunch of cards. So I was really happy that that was our final round.
Me too. It was a really, really good as well as fun round to debate, which I'm really quite grateful for.
Definitely. And I'll say I've watched this round a couple of times, doing these videos, but also editing them. And after each speech, I'm always like, oh yeah, that's the best. Okay, they win. And then the next speech goes, okay, no, they won. It's just so good on both sides. And I can't imagine being a judge and having to decide, because everyone in that round was so amazing. And I wanted to thank you guys for coming on and kind of breaking it down, because a lot of people just watching it may not understand some of the background behind it and some of the stuff that off camera stuff. So it was really helpful to kind of break that side down.
Thank you
For helping us.